Thank you, future me, for that marvelous introduction. I'm sure you're absolutely exhausted, not just because of the time change from Seattle to London, but because this is the last talk of the Game Accessibility Conference Europe Edition 2023. And I'm incredibly excited to be giving it. And it is not like this, measuring accessibility success. So if you're watching this live, or if you've been in person hanging out, you have heard me rambling on for literally the last 2 days, and you probably already know who I am. But for those catching the VOD on YouTube, hi! My name is Tara Voelker. I'm the co-director of the Game Accessibility Conference with the one and only Ian Hamilton, and I'm also the accessibility lead for Xbox Game Studios. So I am lucky enough to get to work with all of our studios to help make their games more accessible. And I'm incredibly proud of some of the folks I work with who are also speakers here at the conference. You all did amazing, and I'm so proud of you. You can also find me at Twitter at Lady Au Pair, LADIEAUPAIR. Yes, it is a Venture Brothers reference, for those who asked. I know someone did. They just announced a movie, okay? It's coming back. But my talk. What are we covering today? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to be covering two things. Things not to do and things to do. That's pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward. So right now we're at an incredible time in terms of accessibility. People want to invest on accessibility, and once you start getting investments, people want to know on their return of investments. And now you start getting all of your favorite business acronyms. And it is an interesting time because the number of people who are senior in these business positions who know a lot about accessibility are few. And this means that we have some very well-intentioned, very creative decisions on how one might measure accessibility success in an organization. And a lot of it is not great. Not like this. And so that's actually where this talk comes from, is how can we stop measuring accessibility success in the wrong ways so we can actually drive the results that we want to have happen. So we're gonna start off with things not to do. These are all things I've actually seen done, not just at Xbox or Microsoft or any other previous place I've worked, but even just things I've seen on Twitter that make me think, oh no, we shouldn't do it like that. So the number one thing that I see that is an absolute problem is people looking at the number of options and using that as a way to determine the accessibility of a title, literally going through the settings menu and counting accessibility features. And I know for a lot of us in the room, we already know why this is a bad idea. But just to go over it for those who are newer to accessibility, there's a few reasons why this is absolutely going to be a no-go. The first off is sometimes these options are actually band-aids. Now that's not always true, but in many occasions, accessibility features are added at the end of the pipeline after people realize that a design decision made earlier created an accessibility gap. And so the option is there to fill the gap in designs that can be inaccessible. So that isn't something we necessarily want to measure by. How many band-aids does this product have? Especially because when we do it that way, we're not rewarding anyone for inclusive design. So again, if a designer had removed the need for these options in the first place, the act of just ranking games based on their number of features doesn't actually track what is more accessible because of things like inclusive design. And finally, there's actually no way to tell if any of these options have been validated by people to fix the problem. We've all heard horror stories of colorblind modes that were just actually simulating colorblindness rather than actually being a solve for those who needed a colorblind friendly game. And I'll even admit, You know, on Forza Horizon 4, there was a one-handed mode that we put in front of a one-handed player, and he's like, I can't use this. So there's also like no validation if the solve even does anything. So not a good method in terms of trying to validate the accessibility of something. Now, the other thing that I see happening a lot, and normally it's coming from the same vein as just counting features, is directly comparing games to each other to figure out which is more accessible. Now, there are a couple problems with that as well. So on top of everything we just discussed, sometimes those games will lack alignment. So what was good accessibility in one game may not be good accessibility or right for another. This is especially true of when genres are vastly different. You know, what's good for a racing game may not be good for an action adventure game. So trying to do these direct comparisons won't actually work. Secondly, if you're trying to benchmark yourself against games that are already out there to determine if you do well, you may not truly know the level of accessibility of that title. I know something else that I've seen happen is people will see a game do something and benchmark against that game. Like, our UI looks like that game's UI, so we must be accessible. That's not always true either, especially because you cannot assume that any studio, even if they have done really great in terms of accessibility before, or perhaps their publisher has done great in terms of accessibility, that doesn't mean that that particular title has done it right. So don't look at a studio who has done something really, really well and just assume that they did that intentionally for accessibility. Sure, maybe you can learn at a great GDC talk or even a talk here at this conference that something was intentional and why you should do it, but never just look at something and assume, oh yes, because this studio thinks about accessibility and they have done this, this must be a good accessibility feature. That's not necessarily true either. Going on from there, very much, again, all of this has been in the same vein, is using checklists. And I will admit, I think I'm part of the problem that caused this checklist mentality. So years and years and years ago, I talked about for Evolve, when we wanted to start retrofitting accessibility, that I made a giant checklist. And the goal of that checklist was to figure out where we were so I knew what we should invest in. And I did put it out there. But the problem with checklists, and as we've grown as an industry, we know, is that, again, that is not inclusive design. And yeah, my checklist did serve a purpose and we were able to get some great stuff out of it, but it's not really something I think we should use to grade accessibility going forward. I think checklists can be a great thought exercise, again, especially in terms of retrofitting and prioritization, but that's not the same as measuring accessibility success. They're a tool, but not something that we should use as a metric or score, especially when doing corporate business number stuff. And when we're talking about scores in general, man, you should never use a single score to tell the accessibility story of your product, because a single number will not be as helpful as you think, and it won't help give you the full picture of your game. This is an example that I hope can kind of drive home what I'm trying to get here. So let's say that we have two different games. The first game has 50% of all of the accessibility blockers that had been identified via user research removed. So it is now 100% friendly to those who are deaf of hard of hearing. There are no known accessibility blockers to them. But the team didn't invest anything in removing any of the bugs that may prevent someone who's playing without sight from being able to play. So 50% of the blockers solved, but all of them are solved in the deaf and hard of hearing space. If we go look at game 2, they just fixed 50% of all of the blockers that were identified for both groups. So 50% for the deaf and hard of hearing players and 50% for the sightless players. Both of those are 50%. The average of both of those games are 50%. But when you dive deeper and look into the numbers, only one of those two games is actually playable by anyone. One of them, yeah, one group can play and the other can't at all. But on the second one, probably neither can play the game fully because of the barriers. So is it the right thing to do to present them as the same numbers? Are they truly equal in accessibility? These are all conversations and nuance that get lost when you start assigning individual score numbers for game titles. And talking about individual single scores for things, please, please do not put a compliance score and an experience score together on one scorecard. I will die on this hill. If there is one thing you take away from this today, do not track compliance and user experience in a single grade. Not like this. So, why should you not have a dual compliance and usability/accessibility score? Well, the first is when you're tracking something like compliance, like for example, the CVAA, being CVAA compliant doesn't actually mean anyone can play your game because it's about communication. So you could say, yes, if you reach this level of accessibility, or if you reach this level of compliance, you automatically get this grade or whatever. That doesn't mean anyone can play. Secondly, gameplay requires unique problem solving, and making gameplay accessible and playable doesn't mean you'll be CVAA compliant. And because of this, you can have a situation where someone is able to play most of the game, have a great time, but not be legally compliant. Or be legally compliant, but not actually have gamers with disabilities able to play. And so if you're tracking that in one score, it's entirely too hard to figure out what is actually happening. So it's terrible. And when you end up particularly having a team that has really invested in having accessibility in their gameplay get dinged on a report with a score because they have a bug that may make them not CVA compliant or something like that, that really kills team morale. So it's something that we really need to work to avoid. Please track compliance in one thing, your user score in another. Don't have it in the same place. And really, we should already be learning from the industry as a whole when we're thinking about how we want to grade accessibility. We already know as an industry that there are downsides to assigning numerical values to these sorts of things. Of course, it's not a Terra talk if I don't just start stealing from other people, so I'm going to start by stealing from Steve Bromley, who's a user researcher. There was an article that he put together that was talking about what does a single number mean and why is it not useful? Well, the first question you always get when you have a single number is that good? Well, without additional context, who knows? Literally, I don't know. Why is it that score? Absolutely great question. Without that additional context and nuance, it doesn't mean anything. Why isn't it higher? Probably something that you want to go and look and research into, right? Well, I don't know. Check with UR, I guess? No idea. Is this benchmark against anything that I can compare it to? Honestly, probably not, because we're so new as an industry in terms of trying to measure accessibility success. And really, a lot of this is stuff, again, that has happened in other industries. When we're talking about trying to make an accessibility score, it's very similar to the idea of trying to create a fun score, what user researchers have to do. So there was a tweet from Elizabeth Zell on Twitter that said, being a games user researcher is just explaining why you can't give a game a fun score over and over again until you retire. Well, I have updated this with my own take to being a games accessibility lead is just explaining why you can't give an accessibility score over and over again until you retire. And, you know, what are we really trying to measure when we're talking about building an accessible experience? We're just trying to figure out, is it fun for players with disabilities? And we've talked about this again and again. I'm not going to rehash Ian Hamilton's talk about difficulty versus accessibility, but the point is, we're trying to figure out, is the challenge worth the reward for players? That is what fun is. And if it is accessible, the challenge will be worth the reward. But we must resist the temptation to give the accessibility equivalent of a fun score. If you really, really want to learn more, I highly recommend the article Why I Hate Fun by John Hobson. Not only is it a single score that doesn't give you the full picture of how you got there, why you got there, and everything else, they're not actionable. If you see a single number, you don't know what to do next. Like I showed on the previous slide, there's immediately follow-up questions. When you see a single score, it simply stops the conversation, which is not what we want, especially in the field of accessibility. We need to be able to move forward. Which is how we transition to the next section. Things to do instead. And I really hope that this can help everyone as we go forward. So I'm going to take a minute and we're going to pause. I mentioned at the very beginning of this is as we move forward in this field, we're going to start getting into business things. And I know, especially if you're at a smaller studio, you may have not been exposed to this, but you're definitely going to be exposed to it if you're, at the publisher level, that kind of thing. So there are two important things to keep track of. The first are your OKRs, your objectives and key results. To put it quite simply, these are your goals. This is what you want to accomplish. This is what you want to do. The next are your KPIs, your key performance indicators. And this is basically how you're measuring progress towards your goal. So when we're thinking about measuring accessibility success, we need to be very clear in our goals and how we're measuring them. That's it. We have to start literally at the basics. And I know that immediately you're probably thinking about how do I apply OKRs and KPIs to the game I'm building? And I love that you immediately went there. That's great. But you should really hold tight. You can't immediately put your focus on products in terms of accessibility measuring and goal setting, especially for teams that are new to accessibility. You need to be able to take a step back. Accessibility doesn't start with the product itself. It begins further back with both the processes and the people who are going to be making the product. You need to have goals around how you are building your title as well as the culture of the team building it. Without these two key components, you won't actually wind up with an accessible product at the end. And if your goal is to create an accessible product, that's where you have to start. So let's break this down a little bit. If your goal is accessible games, you need to measure process and culture. So let's talk about culture. So without a cultural investment, the rest of what you are trying to do doesn't really matter, because if people do not feel invested in accessibility, whatever resources you have or whatever tools or check marks that you try to put in the development process, they won't get followed because people won't think that they're important. And so you need to have the OKR of create a culture where accessibility thrives. When you have that, you can then start thinking about the areas that you can measure to see if your culture is actually creating an environment where accessibility can truly thrive. So these are just a few examples of things I think that teams could be investing in. So the first is something like the percentage of teams completing trainings and certifications. This can be either an internal training or something that's publicly available. If you have an idea of how many people within your company have researched and learned about accessibility, you'll know the likelihood of people who want to be invested. If you find something like only 1% of people have taken the accessibility training course you offer, well, then you're probably not going to have enough people that know about accessibility to actually be able to impact the product in any way. And this doesn't have to be an accessibility training or certification that you yourself built. This could be something that is publicly available. Like literally take the Game Accessibility Fundamentals training course that Microsoft offers. It's free. It could be an easy starting point for you to be able to measure. The next is something like attendance at CHAMPS programs. I'm not going to go into why you should be starting a CHAMPS program or why they're absolutely critical or how having A reoccurring touch point for this group is absolutely key. That's another talk. But if you did spin up a CHAMPS program or already have one, you could be measuring attendance at the CHAMPS program. Do you have a high retention level? Are you gaining new members? Once you look into that, you can then again work on improving your CHAMPS program because you know what's happening. Another piece, again related to a CHAMPS program, would actually be overall team coverage. Do you have someone from every area of development attending the program? Again, with accessibility, if you are a person working in accessibility, you are not an infinitely scalable resource. We need to be able to work with others and influence others to be able to get the work done. And the more touch points you have, the larger web that you've created throughout your company, the more likely you are to have accessibility showing up all the time. We, as single people, can't be in every meetings, which is why we must build these networks. Of course, if you are running your own internal program, you could also keep track of the number of learning opportunities that you have for your accessibility interested folks to continue to grow and learn in the work they do. This could be literally tracking the number of workshops that you're running, tracking the number of guest speakers that you have, anything like that that shows that you are creating these educational moments. And of course, you could always even just track attendance at relevant external events. How many people went and watched a GDC talk that was about accessibility? How many people are watching the Game Accessibility Conference right now? Maybe you're hosting a watch party and you want to see how many people you can have at a watch party. These are all ways that you could start tracking the culture of accessibility within your studio. And again, if you build a good accessibility culture, you'll be able to start influencing your product. Of course, culture is really only half of it. The other half is going to be process. Your team is going to need guardrails to help keep them on track with the accessibility. Even people invested in accessibility who have the best intentions at heart can sometimes forget or make mistakes. So that's why you might want to think of an OKR that's something like create a development process that accounts for accessibility. Again, the guardrails. And this can be really, really easy. So one thing that you could do is identify some key milestones that you want to have accessibility documentation about. It could even be certain features that you want to have available at different milestones. You could then start tracking the percentage of projects that actually met those requirements. And I actually highly recommend that you do testing at milestone phases. And so then not only will you keep track of who was documenting, who was thinking of what, but results from testing as you go forward. And again, I'm deeply, deeply invested in partnering with the UR in every possible sense. Like accessibility and UR are BFF, which is why you see so much overlap between accessibility folks and UR folks, and frequently they're the same people. But you could do things like tracking the percentage of studies that included disabled gamers and keep track of the number of UR studies solely for accessibility. This is a way that you can guarantee that you're at least getting some amount of feedback from gamers with disabilities as part of your normal process. So you have the culture where people want to do accessibility, you have a process where you put on guardrails and checkpoints to help them remember to do it. And hopefully you get a good product at the end. So through these two OKRs, you're basically building a process that, number one, has the opportunity for learning, which is understanding the goals so the team can actively work towards them. Two, the guardrails where they have the process to keep them on track. We have three, a way to get UR validations for the players, and then hopefully finally at the end, success, a game, I don't know, maybe. And I guess now, we can go ahead and say, all right, I guess we could talk about some ways we could measure products. But I'm not actually going to talk about the ways I think you could start measuring that you're probably thinking of. So we're trying to figure out how we can see the culture and process product impact. So how did our culture and process impact our product? Well, one way is if you have a live game, you could see what percentage of updates actually had accessibility improvements. So actually a great example that we've talked about publicly before is that in Sea of Thieves, pretty much 50% of our patches have had at least one accessibility improvement. What is yours? What does your product look like? Maybe you can work on trying to hit 50% yourself. I think you could also do a lot with bug tracking, especially from product to product or title to sequel. So for example, with bugs, we had some screen reader bugs that existed in Forza Horizon 4. When we moved on to make Forza Horizon 5, those bugs no longer exist. We made sure that they got fixed in the next iteration. Because it's the same dev team, same engine, and it is the same title, we can do that sort of direct comparison, and it's very specific data, such as bugs we can compare. Also talking about Forza Horizon 5, something that you might be able to look about is, are there any elements that you can directly attribute to feedback from gamers with disabilities that you launched with? Do you have them documented, and can you showcase them to your team? Again, for Forza Horizon 5, we do have that example. We actually have the ASL and BSL, which came directly out of one of our workshops that we hosted. And again, I really do think there's a lot you could do with bugs specifically. And I'm not just saying this because I used to be in QA. So other things that I think you could investigate. So you probably shipped with some accessibility bugs. That's the reality of game dev. But how many bugs did you ship with? What severity were they? And when did they get marked will not fix? That could be some really interesting information, and you could dig into it. Once you have that, you could start doing comparison. Compared to other bugs with the same severity, what was the fix rate? Were you finding that your accessibility bugs had a lower fix rate than gameplay bugs or other types of bugs? How can you do that kind of comparison? And then finally, you can actually do some research into when are they getting fixed. Did you find that your accessibility bugs were kind of getting fixed as you went throughout the process, or were they getting shoved all into the end of production? I mean, I know that we sometimes struggle with making sure that any narration we have in games is good, because it does frequently get shoved to the very end of the project because we're waiting for the UI menu to get locked first. What other instances like that are hiding in your bugs that maybe a producer who's like a little too into making dashboards can figure out? I'm not sure, but I think it would be really interesting if more of us started learning and investigating these sorts of things with our titles. Of course, there is other sorts of tracking that you can be doing, but I really want to reiterate that you should only compare when it's appropriate. Different dev teams have different needs, different game titles, different engines, so only make fair comparisons. Another thing to call out is that disability isn't a monolith, and tracking just accessibility doesn't necessarily give you a full picture. As I mentioned before, something that is accessible to one group of people may be inaccessible to another group of people, and so you need to make sure that you are getting a layer down deep enough into your research so you can understand how you're impacting different people. Of course, a lot of time when you're going to do this research, you're going to find that at the heart in what you need to fix is going to be a culture, process, or even tech problem. That is what we're really trying to find when we are looking at our games and trying to figure out why didn't this come out as accessibly as we want. And then of course, anything coming out of user research. User research is going to be your best friend, and they are going to be the ones to tell you what the experience is for players with disabilities. So how can you take their information and see how you're improving over time for your disabled players? Of course, after a while, after you feel that your studio has gotten comfortable with accessibility, once you've started getting buy-in from everyone, that's when you can start working towards developing your own standards to use internally. A few things that I do want to note is the first thing is it really has to be achievable. If it seems unattainable, the accessibility goals you set, your devs just won't do it. That's it. They won't. So it needs to feel like they can hit it. And as you're working towards hitting these goals, you're going to have a lot of change management. And you will need to help the teams to make sure they make progress. And when you're tracking it, it can seem slow, and that is completely okay. Incremental progress is still progress. Incremental success is still there. And finally, when you're setting up these standards, you need to make sure that they're easily testable. If it isn't easily testable, it may not be easily explainable, and that means, again, the dev team might get confused and may not want to invest. So be sure to make sure that they can validate it on their end, so no one ever feels surprised when you show up to talk to them about their results against your own standards. And really, I could probably keep going on and on about this topic forever, because measuring success and really making sure you're creating accessible products is incredibly important to me. And again, for me, I see so many people doing things I think could be improved and not taking the time to realize that measuring accessibility success is really about measuring your internal culture and your internal processes. So I'll go ahead and I'll stop talking for now. I'm sure you guys are just exhausted again at the end of day 2. So thank you so much for watching, and I'm gonna hand it back off to future Tara. All right, bye.